All right, good evening, everybody. See, we're getting there. We're getting there. Welcome. Glad to see everyone. Hopefully, you had a good week. Nice warm start to the week. I don't know what this is. I don't want it. Yeah, so last week we actually jumped into the book. You all mostly know. So we covered most of creation last week. We covered the basics. So this week we're going to talk about specifically the creation of man and the image of God. What that means. We're going to talk a little bit, not too much because I don't know a ton about some science type stuff. Especially as we're dealing with creation, we know the obvious modern pushback, which is some form of evolution, and we've said whether that's atheistic or theistic, it's still something we have to think about and contend with as we study the text. And we'll talk briefly about the Sabbath. So those are our three goals. All right, why don't we pray and we can get started. Lord, we thank you for this night. We thank you for everyone who's able to make it out. I ask that you would be with us during this time. Help us to understand your word, understand what you have for us in it, what it means for us and how it relates to you. So just pray you'd be with us during this time. In your name, Jesus, I pray. Amen. Okay, so I actually want to start off with a quote from the... No, we're not going to start with a quote from the book, because that would be silly. Even though we read all of Genesis 1 last week, we should do a bit of a refresh on specifically what we're going to talk about tonight. Okay, so we're going to be in Genesis 1, and we're going to start at verse 26. So we're on day 6 of creation. We had the wonderful artistic board that explained the days of creation very well, if I do say so myself. Precisely. So, so earlier on day 6, you have the land creatures made, and that takes us to verse 26. And God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. And God blessed them and said unto them, "Be fruitful, and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth." That's good for now. Okay, so there's a lot there. I will get to a question asked last week, and then we'll get to the quote in the book. Okay, so one of the main, or a thing that has puzzled a lot of people over the last few thousand years is the language in verse 26 where it says, God said, "Let us make man in our image." So it can be a bit confusing because typically God speaks in the first person and doesn't use the word us to refer to God. I have probable answers, or I have 4 options at least. But what do you guys think? Have you ever seen this, wondered about this, maybe heard someone give an answer on this? Yeah. Yeah, and of course, we do have good scriptural support to have the whole Trinity involved, John 1. So with this, our 4 basic options The first one, I'll just get out of the way because we will soundly reject it, but it's something some people think. So if you're in secular scholarship, you're not Christian or Jewish, you're just studying it as an academic thing. Many scholars use the idea that, spirituality started out with they worship, like shamanistic type stuff, worship animals, trees, stuff like this. And then religion over time progressed to polytheism. We have a whole bunch of gods. And then man refined it a bit till monotheism came about, worshiping one God. And they'll say, you know what, this is good evidence that the ancient Israelites were actually polytheistic at the beginning. Eventually they become monotheistic and kind of edit their texts, and this is like a slip showing that, the Israelites used to believe in all these gods, like a pantheon, like the Canaanites per se. So one, believing the Bible to be the inspired word of God. I do not believe this. Two, the sheer audacity to think that any ancient author intelligent enough to write this book was also stupid enough to miss a major slip on the first page. You really got to be putting some stuff together. And if you're going with the idea that, for any time over a few thousand years, the rabbis could just edit stuff according to their theological takes, no one caught that. You're saying this is so problematic, and no one, Christians and Jews have been noticing this for, since the beginning, and have come up with much better solutions than that. So the other option, which I think is a little bit weak, but it's an option, some people will say this is God using something like the royal we. If you're familiar with how, a king or, the Queen of England, former Queen of England, the Pope, they will make pronouncements in we. It's like the full weight and majesty of their role as king or monarch or whatever. That's an option. I don't think it's a great option because it almost never happens in Hebrew scriptures. It may crop up here and there, but it's by no means a common thing that God speaks in we as he's pronouncing stuff for himself. So then you have options of what's known as the divine council. This is not as scary as it sounds. The idea that God, King in heaven, has a court, like a council, angels in his presence who do his will, his bidding. We see this in a lot of different texts, and that he is speaking with the idea of his heavenly family that are called the sons of God, saying, okay, now we're going to make sons of God on the earth. Even though God is doing the creating, not angels, it's kind of like if I said, hey, you know what, we should order a pizza, and then I make a phone call and order the pizza. We ordered a pizza, I ordered it, okay? I can see from faces that was just that was a bit much. The final option, yeah, you're looking for pizza, okay. The final option would be that this is a forerunning allusion to the divine plurality of who God is. So the Trinity, God in three persons. And as we said last week, explicitly in this text, you already have a being called God, and then the Spirit of God, which is earlier in that. So you already have this allusion to more than one thing going on here. Something like Proverbs 8, John chapter 1, Colossians 2 or 3. all point to Christ being the one by whom everything comes into being, even if it's at God's direction, God the Father. So, yeah, the final option that you have is this is a subtle allusion to the Trinity, which then begins working itself out throughout the rest of Scripture. So you have four options there. One is terrible, the initial scholarship one. One is weak, and I think Ron's angels or the Trinity is probably your two best options here, okay? So that was about 10 minutes on basically one word. So we're going to move faster than that. Not too much faster, but faster. Any questions with that? I know I said a lot right there. Yeah, so even if you were to take the view that this is like angels type thing, the text still makes it abundantly clear that no matter who else might be around, God himself is the creator of what's going on. Like other later like Gnostic sects that came up with their own cosmology had lesser divine beings creating all sorts of things, but yeah, the Hebrew text is abundantly clear. No matter how we take that one, us and we, God is himself doing the creating. Oh, yeah. Yeah, and it's not an insignificant verse. It's not like tucked away in a corner somewhere. And I only sometimes throw out like secular scholarship when it's bad, because when you're reading up on stuff on your own, like if you've never heard this before and you come across it and you're like, oh, wow, Cameron didn't say anything about this. I wonder if does he not know this option? Is he hiding it from us? We're smart enough to be able to deal with nuance and bad arguments and shift them aside. So if you took that view, then humans would not be made in the image of angels. Angels would be some reflection of the image of God. Now, this is why good Christians have that view, especially the late Dr. Michael Heiser. Fantastic. He takes that view. Many others take that view. I think the Trinity is a simpler answer. If you're going to go with the divine counsel, you have to start grappling with some other ideas that I'm not sure what to do with biblically all the time. Yeah. Okay, so now let's get to the quote in your book, and that'll launch us into that. Okay, so humans are made in the image of God. Okay, so on probably down page 10, there's a paragraph that starts with later on the sixth day. We all have that? Okay. Later on the sixth day, God created the crowning inhabitant for his world when he made man in his own image and likeness. The image and likeness of God relate to man being moral and designed to live forever. In distinction from animals, humans also have personality, including intellect, emotion, and will. All of these characteristics are derived from God, their source, who possess them in infinite perfection. Understanding this leads us to consider the inestimable value of every human life. There's a lot in that paragraph. I want to ask, I guess, if there's any questions on that, but also my question to you is that correct? Is that how you've heard about the image of God before in some fashion? Okay, we got one no. So it's saying qualities, and I'll get to what I would propose in a minute. Related to being moral, designed to live forever, intellect, emotions, will, all things that they are considering similar to God. Okay, so has anyone heard anything radically different about what that means? Like they would say, oh, we're in the image of God, we have intelligence, we have free will, we have this, that. Like, is that basically how we have mostly heard it? So here's the dilemma. Like, that sounds good, and we go like, oh, God has infinite levels of intelligence, reason, things like that, and we go, oh, we're made in that likeness. And to whatever extent that's true, okay. Then, of course, you run into a bit of an issue with okay, so let's take intelligence, for example. I'm sure we can all think of someone who is more intelligent than we are. Controversially, you could think of someone who's less intelligent. So then is the more intelligent person more in the image of God? God is obviously very creative. Is the less creative person less in God's image? What do you do with really intelligent animals? Are they sort of in God's image? Because your newborn baby and your fully grown dog, your dog is way more intelligent and capable, Are we talking about something like consciousness? Because you go, okay, again, newborn baby is not really aware of all that much going on. So if qualities that can vary from human to human is what it means to be the image of God or made in the image of God, what do we do with that exactly? Can I get a volunteer to pull up Exodus 20? You'll all know this, but to hear it out loud, we're in the Ten Commandments. Read verse 4. Yep.
Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth.
Okay, thank you. So I think, could be wrong. I try to be clear with you when there are options. Option 1 stands, because Anna's answer is perfectly fine. You could say, oh yeah, well you're just nitpicking. Something created with the idea of they're going to be endowed with a level of intelligence, free will, immortality, stuff like having a spirit as opposed to, something like that. That's a good, valid, a lot of theologians across the board, pastors, teachers, are perfectly fine with that. Why I had you read Exodus 20, verse 4, the command about not making graven images. So the word image is the same not only in English, but in Hebrew. So when you have, in the ancient Near East, you have, sometimes it gets translated as idol, but it's usually the same word, image, okay? So we, of course, always think of idols as bad. An idol is bad, okay? Something in something else's image, we have room to talk, okay? So what the pagan cultures would do, they have whatever god they worship, let's say it's Baal, and then they make a statue out of whatever that is supposed to look like Baal, represent Baal, and be the local manifestation of his presence. So the idol, the statue, the image, was not the god itself. If you have a Baal statue on your mantle, your kid knocks it over and it shatters, Baal's not dead, okay? they still believe that their deity is perfectly fine off doing whatever thunder-related activities he's doing. But they needed to make a new image, because having the image was like the presence and character of that god with them. So that's historically accurate, like we're good there. So the idea would be, linking this to Genesis 1, the creation of man, is that God, something like being made in the image of God, can almost be thought of more as like a status, as opposed to a list of qualities that can vary between people. So the idea is that if this is correct, humans are made to be the image and likeness of their creator, and they are designed uniquely that way, different from all the creation that came before it, because they are not only like, it's not like, oh, you're smart, so you're like God. Like, no, like gorillas are smart, you know. Hopefully we're more smart. But also, gorillas are not meant to be the representatives and ambassadors and creatures that carry out furthering God's kingdom, okay? So that is, right now, that's the approach I would take to it, that the image of God is not just these qualities, though it would include these qualities. God definitely made us to reflect some of his, qualities. But I think it also includes the bigger picture of not just some qualities, but we are like the New Testament language of ambassadors. So we're made to be like the local presence of God among his creation. We're meant to be the hands and feet of the Creator as we're shortly after given this mission on what to do in the rest of the earth. That's a lot. Thoughts, questions? Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I know it probably sounds scary when I say, like, here's my thoughts on the image of God. Let's talk about Baal. Yeah. Yeah, so it's kind of like, it doesn't preclude the definition that we read. All those qualities are still qualities that reflect God and make us like him in certain ways. But I think it's a bigger quality of being made in the likeness of God, the image of God, that we are the ambassadors, something like that. Yeah. And I think while that may seem like a technicality as we're talking about image of God, I do think it has some important, like, real-world ramifications. Because if the image of God is not an intrinsic thing about humans, and it's just a list of qualities, you go like, oh yeah, okay, image of God, consciousness, intelligence, emotion, stuff like this. Well then, like, not to get too dark with it, I'm going to get super dark with it. You sort of just made like a pro-choice argument there, because you go like, oh well, a fetus, a child in the womb, well they don't have intelligence, they don't have creativity, they don't really have free will at this point. In what sense are they the image of God? And of course you would say, oh well, they will possess those things. What about like severely mentally handicapped people? Okay, they don't possess most of the qualities that we just listed as image of God. And that's why I think it's important that it's an overarching status and intended purpose of all humans, before a list of mutable attributes gets added to it. Okay, so I think we're good on that. I think I repeated myself more than enough times. I think we're solid. Let's move on so we can hopefully finish this lesson tonight, because this was all supposed to be last week technically, so we'll see. Just super quick note, verse 27. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. We'll get into like male-female stuff next week because chapter 2 really looks closely at that. All I want to point out here is really nice Hebrew poetry. You can kind of hear the back and forth nature of, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. There's this very distinct like step pattern going on. I don't know what it's called, but it's good Hebrew poetry. Just throwing that out there. And verse 28 we'll also dig into more next week, but it is worth just noting, God blessed them, said unto them, be fruitful and multiply, replenish the earth and subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the fowl of the air, over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. I think there's a different term for it. I've always referred to this as the initial mandate. It's like the first command of creation. So, all creation is sort of following the be fruitful and multiply. Humanity in its unique role as the stewards of God. They are subduing the earth, having dominion over the creatures. And that sounds bad, like depending on how you think about it. You tell someone like, yes, subdue that person, have dominion over them. You go like, whoa, what's going on here? So the only example they have of this so far is God dealing with creation. He is taking chaos, making it into order, and he is creating and organizing in order for the flourishing of everything on the planet. So that's the role that they see. And then they're told, yeah, have dominion. Like you're taking over, in a sense, in stewarding the good flourishing of creation. That's the initial goal that's happening there. And we can dig into it a bit more next week. Why don't we jump to some science that I'll be quick with, because again, I am not the expert. Honestly, if you're really interested in science within the context of Genesis, the website Answers in Genesis is like just solid. Sometimes I think they go a little far afield. Sometimes I feel like they're reaching for things. But if you're interested in this kind of stuff, if you just kind of scroll around on their website, which is massive, they have tons of material, it at least shows you that even if you don't understand it all, like I don't, it shows you that there are serious thinking like people in the scientific field who start with different assumptions and get answers that actually work based on a biblical model of things. Ever since, what was that book or play that talked about the Scopes monkey trial? Something about, I don't know. Inherit the Wind. Yeah, exactly. I feel like ever since that came out, there's been a kind of spirit in the secular world that if you have any opposition to evolution, then you're just sticking your head in the sand. That's really not the case, and even if you don't end up agreeing with everything on the site, they do a really good job of using the Bible as their initial starting point and then letting the science explain that. It's Answers in Genesis. So I have on the website, I have a couple links to just like random different well-known things, like talking about some issues with carbon-14 dating. Forget exactly what I put like 3 links up there, and then I put an image of a video to someone else more intelligent than I explaining the image of God, that's what's up there this week. Yeah, honestly, answers in Genesis, sometimes it's over my head. A lot of times I can get the gist of it, but like it's very technical.
There's a kids section on answers.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and I think, if we have time, I'll mention a couple things, but I think I wanted to address the basis, like the base assumption that is very new and very flawed, in my opinion, because it is an assumption and you have to work on assumptions. So the biggest assumption that is made within evolution, like how evolution got started as a theory, it's something called uniformitarianism or uniformitarian. So like uniformity, that's the basic idea. So I just want to read you an excerpt from this book. This book has nothing to do with Genesis, but they include a section on evolution, so I think this is presented well. So the uniformitarian motto is, "The present is the key to the past." This was from a scientist named Lyell and his colleagues in the 18th century. This was a new lens through which to view the geological record and refute the evidence of the flood. By presuming that the forces acting upon the surface of the earth have been uniform from the beginning, the sudden upheavals of cataclysm could be replaced with the slow grind of endless time and ancestral witness of humanity. Okay, that's not important. Geologic catastrophism propounds that the surface of the earth has undergone extreme and rapid change due to cataclysm. Before Lyell, that scientist, the doctrine of catastrophism was universally accepted as plain fact. Today it is roundly rejected in the scientific community, not because it's been refuted, but because it undermines the theory of evolution and is therefore regarded with contempt. A quote, "The hostility of modern uniformitarians towards geological catastrophism in general and the concept of a universal deluge in particular is a striking phenomenon of contemporary scientific thought." It occurs to me as I read it out loud that some of that is a bit wordy. Basically, so for all of human history, as far as we know, just about every culture on the planet has a flood story. The Bible has a very explicit one. The Babylonians have just all over. All over everyone seems to have a flood story. And it's not just Christians who think there's no way this is coincidence that people groups from literally all over the globe have massive cataclysmic flood stories in their past. So up until sometime in the late 1700s, that was assumed that the shape of the earth as we have it today is influenced by, in large part, some massive global flood. Of course, Jews and Christians point to the Genesis flood for this. However, and I could not for the life of me find the quote, because I heard a good quote from either that scientist or somewhere right around that time, where they were basically saying, you know what? I think I can make this whole thing work without God if you give me infinite time. So the idea is like, okay, we see today that you see how water carves its way through a rock. You can observe this. And they go, you know what? Like, only natural things exist. You know, there's none of this supernatural nonsense. There's no gods, nothing like that. So, okay, this is how water carves through a rock. How long would it have taken the Grand Canyon to be carved? And you do a lot of scientific numbering and do all this, and you go, wow, this must have taken this many millions and millions of years. But that's not necessarily the case if you allow for other things in history, like some extremely large amount of water coming very quickly and having a catastrophic effect on the planet. I remembered one of the articles I put on the website for Answers in Genesis is about assumptions made with ice core samples. Maybe you've heard of that. Like, that's a common thing where up in Iceland, they do it in Antarctica as well. They dig down, or they drill down for hundreds of feet into the ice, bring up samples, and they say, like, okay, so kind of like counting rings on a tree. They go, okay, we have this ice, and you can see layers of dust. And they go, okay, so over a year, it thaws. You know, you get the pollen or the dust settling in the water, then it refreezes, and we get these distinct ice layers. And you go, okay, so we can all witness ice thawing and freezing every year. We're good with this. But it also assumes that certain parts of the world have been having that exact same stable freezing and thawing cycle for like several million years because of how they reckon this. Even though there are other like really good explanations for how this happens. Like, I don't know if you know, within the last like several thousand years, do you know like the Sahara Desert was an almost Edenic, like lush paradise? And you're trying to tell me like this one part of Scotland has just had the exact same thawing cycle for millions of years, year after year, and you can prove this. Now, some of you might have like good rebuttals that I don't have the answers to, and that's why I link to smarter people. Yeah, so that's the thing. So this scientist came first, and kind of, he's a geologist, so no pun intended, but he kind of like laid the foundation for Darwin's work with his idea of the present is the key to the past. So we see, you know, these tiny changes happening, and then we go, okay, how can it account for all that we see? Suddenly the Earth is like 4 billion years old as they keep doing that. So Darwin did a similar thing. He's on that trajectory, and he looks at similar birds and similar like, you know what? There's similarities between these animals, and kind of starts coming up with ideas of, can we use that same slow grind of time to explain biological life? Now, Darwin was actually smarter than a lot of people give him credit for, because there's something referred to as Darwin's black box. In his own works, he talked about things like, you know, he's theorizing on how all these breeds and creatures and species came to be. But he was smart enough to say, like, you know what, if they find out later, like once science develops, if they find out that, like he didn't have the ability to look at cells, like in a microscope, something like that. So he said, basically, if science finds something that is, it's called irreducible complexity. Like, this thing is so complex in itself, you can't account for how it would spontaneously be created. Maybe I should put a link to something like that on the website. That would be good. Because I know I didn't explain that well, and I don't know how I could keep going in the amount of time. But yeah, there's a lot of really good reason to doubt it. And again, we talked last week. Some Christians hold to theistic evolution, and I don't like it, but okay. But there's really good logical, spiritual, and scientific reasons to doubt, and that's why I linked to that site in particular. It's also worth noting, just quickly, second law of thermodynamics, known as entropy. Everything is running down. Yeah, everything decays. So I was reading a quote that was basically saying, like, we know the second law of thermodynamics is absolute. We see it in the cosmos, continuing to expand. We see it all across this. But biological beings seem to be doing the exact opposite, according to evolution. And it was like, someday we'll have to exhaust all of our scientific wisdom in order to, get these two things to fit. And you're like, well, you're saying your theory runs contrary to like a major law of physics, and you're still okay with that? And go ahead. Oh. Yeah. And of course, in order to have true like Darwinian evolution, they try to explain everything naturally as long as you give them one big miracle right off the bat, which is the existence and Big Bang. Like, the last thing I'll say is to answer your question from last week. No, your question from last week. You brought up on day 4, it says, Well, yeah, you brought it up, so I'll... Oh, yeah. It said, day 4, God created the sun and the moon and the stars. And you were asking the question of like, well, why is he calling one thing two different things? The sun is a star, right? Like he created the sun and the star. So, yeah, I think it's a category error. We're trying to apply modern scientific categories that have only been made up within like defined a certain way in a certain period of time. But also, like, even within how science currently categorizes things. So it's kind of like the relationship between squares and rectangles. Like, all suns are stars, not all stars are suns. So a sun is a star that has planets orbiting it. So apparently, because I was doing some sun-based research today, our sun is like an average-sized star. It's not particularly enormous compared to the other ones. It's not particularly small. And you're like, oh, so like, look out if it's a clear night. Oh, they're all mostly like the size of our sun. Like, that's the average star, and that's kind of crazy to think about. When you got to look at the downstream consequences, like Pastor was saying, there's just, if you take Darwinian evolution, it is nihilism all the way down. Like, everything you know is just an accident. It has no purpose, no meaning. It's going nowhere. I really dismiss new atheists, and by new atheists, like even Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, like they're older now, but that new atheism, because they try to hijack Christian morality. They say like, oh, it's just atoms bouncing around, it's all chance, it's this and that. You should still be a good person, though. We should still work for the benefit of humanity. I respect the position of old school atheists, like a famous, Nietzsche. Like, I'm going to disagree with Friedrich Nietzsche on his conclusions, but he's like, yeah, God is dead. Do whatever you're going to do. Like, might is right. Be like, the strong survive. Be strong. Morality doesn't matter. I disagree with this, but it's a more logical position. Darwinism also introduced like hardcore racism, because then they started saying, like, there's always been racism, but then they had scientific grounds to start saying, like, you know, that other group of people, like, did they even evolve from the same thing? Are they, like, because now we have, well, it means to be human, you came from this line of ape-like creatures. What about these people over here? Like, we're like different species. And they justify, like, okay, look into the eugenics. Don't look into the eugenics program. If you want to, look into the eugenics program. It's horrifying, and it's based on Darwinian evolution thrown into racial, social things. That also gets us back to the pro-life debate, because eugenics and Margaret Sanger are bored. Okay. We are far afield from talking about suns and stars, and it is about 5 past, so I think we should get going. Anything else I want to ramble about, we can talk after class if you want. All right. Lord, thank you for this day. I thank you for digging into your word. We thank you that we can trust your word, and we thank you that there are intelligent people doing research to help us understand your word better, on the scientific front, on the theological front. We just thank you that we can get clear depictions of who you are, what you've done in the world, and what you intend for humanity. So we thank you. We pray you'd bring us back safely next week. In your name, Jesus, I pray. Amen.